Hello, and welcome to Trusting the Courts, Perspectives of State and Federal Judges. Tonight's conversation is co-produced by UW-Impact and the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public. My name is Chris Olsen-Phillips, and I serve as the Associate Director of UW-Impact. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. UW-Impact is the nonpartisan legislative advocacy program of the University of Washington Alumni Association. We rally community members to support students, the University of Washington, and higher education. As a part of our mission, we aim to promote civic engagement, collaboration across difference, and informed participation in our democracy. Our work and content such as tonight's webinar are directly supported by Alumni Association member dues, so a sincere thank you to all of the UWA members and the audience this evening. The UW Center for an Informed Public is a multidisciplinary research center at the University of Washington, co-founded by the School of Law, the Information School, and the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering. The CIP studies how information flows online, with a particular focus on how rumors are spread and how these rumors result in values and actions. They also focus on how communities navigate complex informational environments and support a more informed public. A couple of quick housekeeping items before we begin our programming this evening. First, thank you to all of you that submitted questions for our panelists in advance. We've used those questions to structure our conversation this evening. Should you have any additional questions that arise during our program, please feel free to submit them via the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We're pleased to host a moderated webinar tonight focused on how misinformation, shifting public perceptions, and political polarization are changing the ways in which we regard the state and federal judiciary. Our experts for this evening's conversation will be Washington State Supreme Court Chief Justice Debra Stevens, U.S. District Court Judge Robert Lasnik, and CIP expert and moderator Ali Durran. Chief Justice Stevens joined the state's highest court in 2008 and began her second term as Chief Justice in 2025. Prior to that, she served on the Division III Court of Appeals. During her appellate career, she appeared more than 125 times in front of the Washington State Supreme Court and as the counsel of record in front of the United States Supreme Court. She's also taught constitutional law as an adjunct professor at the University of Gonzaga. Judge Robert Lasnik has been a leader at the state and federal level across his 36 years on the bench. He was appointed in 1998 by President Bill Clinton to the district court. From 2004 to 2011, Judge Lasnik served as the chief judge for Western Washington. And from 2010 to 2015, Judge Lasnik was appointed by Chief Justice John Roberts to serve on the Judiciary Conference, a body that helps govern federal policy in relation to the judiciary. He was also appointed by Judge Roberts to serve on the Executive Committee. Ali Durran is an expert from the Center for an Informed Public. She is a Research to Policy Fellow who focuses on how the Center for an Informed Public can translate its research into actionable policy that helps strengthen information systems and build public trust. Ali received her MPH from Yale University. She received her JD from the University of Toronto and received her BA from the University of British Columbia. Before we kick off our conversation, Ali is going to take us through a few slides that go look at research from the Center for an Informed Public on how misinformation and online narratives are shaping our perceptions of the judiciary. Ali, thank you so much for being here with us this evening, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's always difficult to follow those two biographies. I'm very happy to be here. So before we get started and move on to the question and answer component of this evening presentation, I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the research that we've been doing at the Center for an Informed Public, and sort of just bring everyone who has taken the time to be here into the fold and do a level set of the landscape that we exist in right now with respect to trust in our courts and the threats that the judges in our state and nationally are experiencing. So why are we here? So everyone, I think, is here because they have some interest in the trust and the health of our state courts and our federal courts. I want to talk a little bit. So last year in 2025, the Washington State Bar Association approached the Center for an Informed Public at the University of Washington to partner with us on some research to help understand better where negative narratives about the judicial branch are originating and how those negative narratives are sort of impacting trust in our courts and the threats that are coming across judges' desks and to their front doors. They were seeking to understand how negative narratives circulate online and what those narratives reveal about shifting public attitudes toward the state's justice system. And last fall, we conducted a series of interviews with judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and court administrators to find out how legal professionals in Washington state are communicating and engaging with the public through existing channels. So we come to this work in this moment I have on the slide here where trust is sort of split across the nation, right? Trust in state courts is actually increasing. It's up 10 points from 2021. While trust in federal courts is decreasing and actually related to partisan preferences, decreasing heavily among Democrats. Threats to federal judges have increased dramatically since 2021. So between 2015 and 2021, threats to those protected by U.S. Marshals, those are our federal judges, increased by 400%, with threats to state court justices and judges increasing at the same time. And so we come to this problem, I guess, to frame a little bit and provide some context. So there's this challenge of information, I think, that we're thinking about in the world that we're living in today. And we're living in a world where things don't always make sense. And so we're all trying to kind of make sense of the information ecosystems that we're living in. We're all trying to understand or kind of tell stories to ourselves that allow us to make sense of the political, of the cultural context that we're living in. At the same time, the information ecosystem that we live in has changed, and our communication infrastructure hasn't necessarily kept up. And while that happens, we tend to tell ourselves stories that allow us to make sense of the world, and that's going on sort of at every level of society. And we come to this sort of with an understanding that bad information doesn't tell the whole story about the problem that we're facing here. So correct information or facts are not necessarily a vaccine or an answer to this challenge. Our messengers matter a ton in the way that we think about communicating with the public. And so do the stories that we tell about the institutions that we put up and why they're important to the health of our democracy. And so we have gone through two phases at the University of Washington through a research project that we have put up in partnership with the Washington State Bar Association. Phase one of our work included a series of ethnographic interviews with judges, prosecutors, law professors, court administrators, and other attorneys in Washington State, through which we did really a looking in the mirror exercise, trying to help the judicial branch in Washington State understand how it communicates and touches points with the public on public communication. In phase two, which we're working on right now, we are going through an exercise of social listening to understand what public narratives exist in Washington State about the judicial branch and understand what key conversations are going on about cases in federal and state courts, but also just generally about our courts in Washington State. So through our research, I just want to frame the conversation that we're about to have through sort of these three key sets of findings that we found through our interviews and through our online listening as our research evolves. So one is kind of core and unsurprising to the judicial branch as a whole. One thing that we found is that there is a cultural hesitancy to communicate from the judicial branch in Washington State and in the nation as a whole. There's kind of a propensity towards silence that's existed, and there are some people that are able or willing to break that mold. And that hesitancy to communicate is grounded in some really, really real structures. One of those being ethical restrictions for judges. There is a code of ethics that restricts or cabins the way that judges are able to speak about what they do in some ways. A lack of training, and then a need for narrative, I think, comes out as well. Second, we found that there's a lack of structural support in the Washington State Judicial Branch for communications infrastructure. So there's kind of little funding for communication staff across the state. There's minimal training on media for for lawyers and for judges, and then no monitoring that goes on of sort of active social media or in sort of our modern infrastructure. Our third key finding is that there is a need for kind of a greater, stronger narrative or story about the judicial branch in Washington state. Thinking about like two kind of predominant pieces of that, one being sort of a clarity that we can bring to the purpose and of the judicial branch to a healthy democracy, and to the accessibility of the way that we talk about what we do as lawyers and as judges. And the rest of this conversation will move into thinking about moving forward and how do we exist in this moment of low trust and take the things that we have to create a healthier relationship between our judicial branch and the public that we live in. And so one of the things that we've talked about is that we need a cultural shift. So we need a cultural shift across the judicial branch toward speaking and breaking this culture of silence, and connecting with the public more and shifting towards a publicly oriented communication strategy. We need to dedicate real resources, so time, money, human labor, towards developing an authentic narrative that connects with the public and builds communications infrastructure. And then finally, we need to develop clear communication and find spokespeople and external advocates for the judicial branch that can help sort of do this work. And so I leave with the question, what can we do? And I'll invite our panelists to join us, Judge Robert Lasnik and Chief Justice Stevens, to answer some questions about the landscape in Washington state. So welcome, both of you. Thank you very much for being here with us today. So leading into sort of some of what I said about, I think this culture of silence that exists across the judicial branch. I want to turn it to both of you. I think I'll start with you, Chief Justice Stevens, to ask, you've both sat on the bench for quite some time in Washington state. And as we know, the trust numbers are changing, the threats are significantly up. From your perspective and where you sit, what has changed today? What is different?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Ali, and thanks for having me here this evening for this important conversation. I joined the Washington Supreme Court in January of 2008. Before that, I was just 1 year on the Court of Appeals. I will say when I joined the bench, coming out of private practice, and you go through judicial college, baby judges school, and they talk to you about the ethics of engaging with the public. The predominant theme was, when in doubt, don't do it. Don't say it. Keep quiet. Let the opinions of the court speak for themselves. Let the orders of the court speak for themselves. And I think one of the big things that has changed from a judicial orientation is a newer generation of judges, and I guess I still feel in that group somewhat, see that the advice is exactly backwards, because we have an obligation under our canons of judicial conduct, just as lawyers have an obligation under their rules of professional conduct, to promote trust and confidence in the judiciary. And I think the original thought was, well, that's a given. People see this as a trusted institution, so we should be careful not to erode trust by speaking up, as opposed to maybe having a better situational awareness that institutions of authority, and in particular institutions of government, are increasingly less trusted. And part of building public trust and confidence is being more engaged. So I think some of the conversations have changed, the willingness of people to reach out directly to courts, directly to judges, is much higher than it was back then. But also the need for judges individually and courts collectively to be engaged in community and letting people see the direct connections between their life and what happens in court. I think the importance of that increases every year. So I'll stop there. Just as, to me, as a table setter, I think that pivot from the least you can do to the most you can do is something I have seen change over my time on the bench.
Thank you. Very interesting. And Judge Lasnik, do you see a sort of a similar trend on the federal bench?
I would say that federal judges in general are reluctant to engage with the media or the public except through their written opinions. I think that's changing. I don't think it's changing fast enough, but we are seeing more people feeling the need to defend the independence of the judiciary and the safety of judges. It's getting to the point. We have much better statistics in federal court through the U.S. Marshal Service, but state court judges don't have the same protections that we do, and they're still under the same kinds of threats that we are. So we feel a great solidarity with our state court judges in this area. I have always been somebody with my background in journalism who believes that as long as I'm not talking about a case that's in front of me, I can speak up. And I've gone to the media that covers the courts and said, if you have any questions about some of the difficult legal principles at play in a case, as long as it's not in front of me, I'll be happy to explain, why is this case started in state court and get removed to federal court? What does that mean? What's the difference between a preliminary injunction and a temporary restraining order? These are difficult processes for working journalists to get through. And, we have a bench bar press committee in the state of Washington, chaired by Chief Justice Stevens, that works towards building bridges between the media, the bar, and the judiciary.
Thank you, Lasnik. So interesting. I would like to ask the two of you. So I think sort of both of you have alluded to this, like this tension, this difficulty, I think, to come to this work. What brings you personally to this conversation? What motivates you to sort of speak out and be a part of this conversation about trust in the courts?
Well, I think that we have a great judiciary in the state of Washington, both on the state court level and on the federal level. And I wish the public could see it more. Now, you can watch state Supreme Court arguments on TVW, and they've been doing this for decades now. It's an example of, whoa, that's really interesting. You can learn about it. I have fought for cameras in the courtroom in federal courts for a long time and have not had anything more than marginal success. But the more the public sees what we do, the more confidence they would have in what we do and the fact that we are fair-minded, nonpartisan, and motivated towards justice.
Yeah, I mean, that's really well said, Judge Lasnik. And, I think the longer I do this, the more passionate I feel about the connection between what we do in the justice system and just the core of democracy. I mean, if people are going to believe in, if we're all going to believe in a sustainable democracy, the role of the courts is the backbone of that. The ability of every person to have their grievance heard, regardless of political power or economic power, and the need to make that promise, that democratic vision real. I was just recently speaking with some other Washington judges. We were at a wonderful conference a couple weeks ago. Judge McEwen, Judge Robart from the Ninth Circuit in the Western District, and Justice Stephen Breyer spoke. And I mean, I actually got emotional hearing him talk with passion here at 87 years old about, he said, remember in the Gettysburg Address, and then it was funny, a room full of lawyers and judges trying to remember what line is he referring to in the Gettysburg Address. But he said, a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And what was so perfect is he said, at the time Lincoln started with that, he said, but now we're today and it doesn't look so good. And we're in a civil war. And the challenge is, can a nation so conceived and so dedicated long endure? And what are we going to do about it? And I guess that's what brings me to this work, is that's the moment we're still in. The promise has never been fulfilled. At the time all men are created equal was said, it didn't include me or you, Ali. It didn't include enslaved people, but it didn't mean that the proposition was static or frozen in time. It meant that, the democracy and the justice principles have to stay real. So to me, I really think this just goes, I feel like a bit of a civic evangelist as a judge, because I really believe that if we let go of the framework because of the frustrations, uh, power loves a vacuum. We can't let go of, the promise and the framework of these institutions, and the courts are part of that. We need to work to make them better, make them more accessible, make the promise real. But that's what really, keeps me going every day, playing my role as a judge, but or that's hardly the right way to put it, playing a role as a judge, doing my job impartially, fairly on the cases before me, and also recognizing that I have a position that allows me, to help bring people into feeling a sense of belonging in the democracy and in the legal system.
Yeah, we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence this year. And I've been heard to say, taking a Lincoln-esque approach, 12 score and 10 years ago, you can do the math, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, the Constitution came a few years later, and the Constitution, especially in 1787, was conceived in slavery and dedicated to the proposition that only certain white men who owned property were created equal. So think of how far we have come in those 250 years in giving some life to that Declaration of Independence. But sometimes it's two steps forward, one step back, one step forward, two steps back. But as Dr. Martin Luther King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So I'm an optimist that we are still bending towards justice, even during these turbulent times where the judiciary is under threat of attack. You see the Department of Justice using terms like declaring war on judges, and you see the president demonizing judges as under the influence of foreign countries and deserving impeachment. That has happened before in our history from interest groups, but never from the acting attorney general and never from the president. So this is a very, very difficult moment for judges. And that's one of the reasons that Chief Justice Stevens and I want to speak out about the importance of independence and the importance of a judiciary that can be trusted.
Thank you both. I think Chief Justice Stevens, I think you said something interesting in sort of focusing on, I think, this idea of a vacuum of power, the possibility of a vacuum of power that occurs, I think, if we don't defend what we have. And I'm interested, and I think that kind of goes hand in hand, I think, with sort of Judge Lasnik, what you've said about existing in this unique moment where we're experiencing threats from parts of the government itself. And so I think I've been thinking a lot about how do you think judges can go about, the two of you are occupying this role of spokespeople, which is incredibly important and brave. And how do you think the judicial branch and its actors, specifically judges, can navigate this unique call to sort of stand up and do what you're doing and defend the judiciary in this way that requires almost this values-based conversation that you're having right now? Are there spaces where that can happen? And how do you think do you think it's possible to organize judges in a way that allows for that narrative to enter into sort of like the public sphere?
Yeah, I'll start by saying I do think that what makes a big difference to people's understanding and trust in the courts is when they actually see courts in action. So I do think it matters that we, adequately resource courts. So, which is a chronic issue, especially in state courts, and we know, from experiences across history that underfunding institutions of government is a great way to erode trust and confidence because we cannot but disappoint people if we don't have the resources to meet their needs. But I think when people see court and, they see a judge on the bench talking to people, face to face, addressing their issues, listening to them makes a huge difference. So I think judges want to be supported to be able to do what they do best, which is listen to arguments, understand people's problems, and address those. So I think we can help support that through the structures we create and support. And, in our system in Washington as Chief Justice, the Supreme Court does not have management oversight over all of the courts. We have court rule oversight. Of course, we have decisional authority, but our courts are, county level managed. So finding better ways to support that, I think can make a real difference. And then also just having community built around groups, not just in the legal profession, but more broadly to have interdisciplinary conversations and create spaces for conversation. I mean, one amazing thing that's been happening over the past year, we launched it with the State Bar Association last Law Day, which is May 1st, is the Speak Up for Justice series that's been going around the state, gathering community members. And, in small communities, 100 people will show up to hear discussion about challenges in the judiciary and threats to democracy and talk about what everyday folks can do. And it's been hugely successful. I think it shows that people want to engage on this, and we need to support the ability of judges to go out into the community, such as through that, what's called the Rule of Law Ambassadors Program in the State Bar Association.
And my colleague Jack Kuhnauer and I have gone out on these Speak Up for Justice venues in different parts of the state. And there also have been state court judges who would join us. And it's very important that, the biggest advocates of our justice system are jurors who sit on the cases and say, wow, this was really interesting. And I got to be on a jury with, I live in Mukilteo, but I got to be with somebody who lives in West Seattle. We had different age groups, we had different religions, but we got together and the judge gave us instructions and the lawyers explained what was going on, and we reached a great decision.
Yeah, can I just comment on that? There's been some academic research about civic engagement from people who've been able to do jury service. And across the board, people who'd never voted before became, really interested in what was happening in their community, and they voted for the first time. They became more involved in volunteer organizations. There's just, that's probably a topic for a different time, but, there are fewer and fewer jury trials in federal and state court, partly because of limited resources, the cost of jury trials, et cetera. And so and also it's very difficult. I wish we've been trying to get more funding support to make it possible for people to perform jury service. They have to take time off work and have childcare and that sort of thing. But I love when, Judge Lasnik's example has really shown up in the research as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's completely related. I think sort of want to spend the next 10 minutes sort of splitting into these two sort of categories of what we're thinking. I think on one hand, we're thinking about communications challenges. On the other hand, there are these real grievances, I think, like access to justice. And I think what you speak about here with fewer and fewer jury trials, for example, like is all kind of part and parcel of this question of trust. And so I know I've spoken with both of you about Washington is kind of unique in the way that the state and the federal courts have a relationship with one another. And we have these kind of unique entities that have public touch points, which I think don't exist in other states. I want to ask you both, maybe we'll start with you, Judge Lasnik. how you think we can build on those entities that exist, like the Bench Bar Press, for example, or like some of our public outreach programs in high schools or in other parts of the community to build on trust and sort of adapt to the modern world as well.
Well, one of the things that I started when I was chief judge that I'm very proud of is we have a civics education program in our federal court that teaches civics teachers in middle school and high schools all across Western Washington. And through that, we have influenced literally hundreds of students to hear about the justice system. And, you know, when I taught uh, about the Constitution, I would start with showing people how paltry really the United States Constitution is, especially if you set aside the Bill of Rights. It's just, you know, Article 1, Congress, Article 2, the executive branch, Article 3, the judiciary. And all it says about the judiciary is there will be a Supreme Court and such inferior courts, oh, how I hate that word, as Congress deems to create, and then a couple of other articles, but you know, not much there. And I show them a fabulous constitution that says everyone has a right to a job, everyone has a right to health care, everyone has a right to know that they're safe in their homes, and no law enforcement officer will ever enter without a signed warrant. And all these fabulous rights. And I asked the teachers, what country do you think this is? And, you know, people say Finland or Denmark or Switzerland. And the answer was the Soviet Union. And the message is a constitution is not worth the piece of paper that it's written on if there is not an independent judiciary to enforce the rights in that constitution. And we have seen how countries such as Poland and Hungary and Turkey have kneecapped their judiciary to allow autocratic rule to take place. And we cannot allow that to happen. And so that message goes out to the high school and middle school civics teachers and through them to the students they teach. And I hope that it will take hold in the population.
Thank you, Judge Lasnik. I think thinking about sort of this concept of judicial independence, we have been, as part of our work at the Center for an Informed Public, moving through this research and searching for sort of the narratives and the language that resonate with the public. Two of the themes that have come up in our research on public sentiment have been concerns about judicial activism and polarization and partisanship in the courts. I want to ask you both sort of in this moment that we exist in, how do you think about addressing those concerns or speaking about those concerns in your roles?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. I think, you know, I think when we talk about judicial independence, it has to be discussed in the greater context of judicial accountability as well. Just as I think when we talk about individual rights and civil liberties, they come with responsibilities. I mean, it's all a piece of a social contract. So I think that a judge's obligation can't be fulfilled without having true independence. You've got to be free from the fear that you're going to get thrown out of office or physically attacked at your home, free from partisan influence and money influence and all of that. But that doesn't mean that a judge exists in a hermetically sealed container. And I think, you know, students of history of, you know, our American democracy and, you know, the English common law system, you know, show lots of examples where, you know, judges need to be practical people. You know, these are not esoteric principles that animate our law. It's the practical application of rules and decisions. So I think for a judge to be both independent and accountable also requires that we give judges the space to be in the real world. And so I find that some of the misinformation that happens is, gosh, if you see a judge out doing like what we're doing this evening, talking about democratic principles and the structure and framework of the justice system, that somehow that's going beyond a judicial role, as I started with, to me, that's exactly the opposite look. We have an obligation to explain the justice system and promote trust and confidence in the justice system. But I do find that when I talk with people, where they're really concerned about specific issues or specific rulings, some of the accountability piece could be answered just with some greater transparency and explanation. I mean, doing things like what Judge Lasnik was discussing, talking to someone about what does it mean for this or that procedure to happen, giving some on-background discussion to media so people can contextualize, because the experience of justice is a community event. It's not that some inputs go to a judge in a quiet little room and the judge kicks out an answer. It's a community experience. And if people don't see it happening, then it's not happening. I mean, to me, that's a piece of it.
And part of it is also recognizing that judges are not infallible. If you look back at the history of the United States, you can look at the Dred Scott decision from the U.S. Supreme Court that said, slaves can never be citizens because, basically they're inferior. That's a ridiculous and awful ruling from the United States Supreme Court. Plessy versus Ferguson, saying it was constitutional to have separate but equal in Jim Crow. Terrible decision. And the Korematsu case approving of the Japanese internment as recently as World War II. That was an executive order from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and it should have been declared unconstitutional at the time. But a number of the Supreme Court justices were FDR appointees, and most of them, not all of them, who were, decided to support what the president was saying. And one of the reasons that Justice Robert Jackson is one of my heroes is he had the guts to say no, even though I was appointed by Franklin Roosevelt and even though I was Attorney General under Franklin Roosevelt, this is unconstitutional. And we have come around eventually to say, yes, that was a bad decision. And if you look at the gay marriage in the state Supreme Court, there was originally that should be not legal, even as recently as in the our lifetimes, and then ultimately became the law of the land to allow it. So judges are not infallible, but we should not be threatened with violence, and we should not be threatened with impeachment for rulings. There's appeal and there's history. And as I said, the arc of the moral universe towards justice.
Can I add one thing to that? That is really so well said. And I think when I consider what some of the myths and misperceptions are about the law, I think one of the biggest myths is that the rule of law is static, that it's this set of principles just sort of handed down, when that has never been what it is. I mean, the rule of law has to be not just the decision of one judge, right? It's a collection of principles, but those principles reflect understandings of human behavior, of good and evil, of accountability. There's a lot of bias that has always been baked in to the foundations. And it's natural that as our perceptions of human behavior or accountability evolve, those rules will evolve. And that doesn't mean that judges are changing the law or being activists. They're again living in the reality that these are social institutions. I mean, I think a great example of the evolution, well, Judge Lasnik just gave many of, understandings where we look back at a decision and think, how could any court that calls itself a justice system have said that? But more around human behavior and sociology and neuroscience. Think about the changes that have been made in recent years around juvenile justice and just a more developed understanding of what leads to criminal behavior and immaturity in the developing brain and the prefrontal cortex. And, just it brings people to a different understanding of what makes a person culpable and to what level, and has really led to a fresh examination of Eighth Amendment principles and crime and punishment. That to me is not judicial activism at all. It's taking a principle and recognizing it has to develop. So I think if we can talk more meaningfully about the law and not act like, oh, there's a static principle and my job is just to apply it to a set of facts, but really talk about what's the kernel of truth here, what's the understanding, what are we trying to achieve, then I think I think we're being more honest about what judges do. That's the judging. So it's not and I think that the counter narrative that it's I don't like the calling balls and strikes. That's a little incomplete, but that it's something you could just plug into AI and get an output. That's just missing the whole point of what our legal framework develops from, which is an understanding of human behavior and accountability.
I think that's exactly right, Justice Stevens. I think it's been interesting, I think, to go through this process and hear from prosecutors and defense attorneys who experience the struggle from a different angle, I think, and they have a very natural, I think, reaction to sort of a lack of trust in the law. I think the knee-jerk reaction is sort of what you articulate, is to move towards this balls and strikes model, because that theoretically cultivates trust in a different way as it removes the theory of bias, et cetera. But I completely agree with you that I think we've done ourselves a disservice in removing the human element from the narrative of the legal system. And I think sort of recentering the human will feel more true and authentic as we sort of go forward, if we can do that and create a narrative about what we do that is based on both. We have just a couple of minutes before I want to switch over to audience Q&A. But the last question I have for both of you, what gives you hope about the judicial system going forwards? Are you hopeful?
Well, I think I've said what makes me hopeful is the arc of the moral universe. But also, when if you look back to when I started in the legal profession, they were all white men on the United States Supreme Court and the Washington State Supreme Court. And we now have uh, racial diversity and ethnic diversity on both those courts. In my court, we have more diversity than ever before. And as the justice system looks more like the people who we serve, it will do a better job. So I'm hopeful that we will continue that trend. I don't understand why diversity, equity, and inclusion have become curse words in some people's minds. Those are great things for making the world better and making the justice system better. And we will continue on that path for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. I promised Judge Lasnik and I didn't coordinate our remarks, but I think a different way I'll frame it, or to dovetail with that, I think we are in the last decade for sure. And I think, for a lot of people, a real aha came in 2020, in just an awakening of so many marginalized people and communities in our society beginning to see and take power. So not that the white authority structure suddenly opened up and caused the change. It's people seeing, understanding, and taking their power. And I think some of the messiness, some of the real tension and division is partly a reaction to that. And I think it's necessary. So to me, I'm optimistic about it. If everybody's just quietly being polite, then a lot of people are not being heard. And they were never being heard. And their experiences weren't being validated. So to me, I'm just optimistic that it's really hard right now, because until we go through the pain of saying what we were doing, what was normal was not ever neutral, and we've got to have a greater understanding of what inclusiveness means, we're never going to move forward. So that gives me a lot of hope, but it also makes me cling to what we started with, which is don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We can reform institutions, we can make them stronger. we can use the container that was built to move in the right direction. But the forces of power and money will fill a vacuum if those institutions are not strong. So I do worry about people being asked to hate their own rights or hate their own government, because that's a no-win proposition. But I'm very optimistic. To me, the struggle is full of optimism because it shows that we're in a transformative time.
I think you're absolutely right. It's like a moment of truth and reconciliation has to come before what comes next. And absolutely. Thank you both for those thoughts. Before we move on to questions from the audience, I just want to thank you both so much for being here. And not only thank you both so much for being here, but for being engaged in this work, for speaking out at countless events on top of the work that you already do in public service. And thank you for your dedication and public service to justice and the rule of law. Thank you.
Echo Ali's thanks. We truly appreciate your perspectives and insights. And now we're going to transition to the Q&A portion of our event. We've had many audience submitted questions. I'm going to pose the questions to allow Ali to respond in her role as expert in addition to our judicial participants. We were fortunate to have a myriad of great questions submitted both in advance of our webinar and during our time together, so we'll get to as many as possible while we can. I'm going to pose each question and then allow each participant the opportunity to respond before moving to the next question. So our first question, I think, dovetails with a lot of the conversation that's been had, and that is, how durable is the judicial branch under current pressures? What happens if legal authority erodes? And one audience member asked, at least some of the loss of trust in the courts is related to the behavior of some of the high courts in the nation. How do you address that lost trust?
The U.S. Supreme Court obviously garners the most interest, and when it makes a decision such as undoing Roe versus Wade, it's going to cause a certain percentage of the country to feel, what the heck is going on? What happened to stare decisis? Why is this being changed? And of course, that's going to happen one way or the other in a lot of cases. But, for the most part, the U.S. Supreme Court is deciding things pretty much in the same way it's decided it throughout its lifetime, in terms of mostly unanimous decisions, certainly some partisan decisions that seem to be going one way or the other. But as I said, if you look at the history of the Supreme Court, there have been some mistakes in there, and eventually they've gotten corrected. But I think that the trial courts, for the most part, have retained their reputation for being fair and impartial. A lot of the important decisions that have been critical of this administration and this Justice Department have come from longstanding judges who were appointed by President Reagan or President Bush, one and two. And I think that we have maintained our nonpartisan and independent way of deciding cases in a way that should give people confidence.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I'll just add briefly. I think we see all across the country, especially at the trial court level, judges are making really hard calls and really courageous decisions. And it's pretty scary when we see, and it was just briefly mentioned, some judges have suffered, terrible losses, murdered family members and attacks directly for decisions they make. And yet, judges keep doing it and keep coming back. It's just really inspiring that, it means that much. So I think sometimes people also look at some of the ethics issues that have come out about U.S. Supreme Court justices and the lack of an ethics code. And I think one of the strongest messages that we all send is, in every state, there are rigorous ethics codes. Washington is one of those states that has a very proud tradition of an independent judicial conduct commission, not under the control of any judges. And the accountability piece, I think should give folks a lot of confidence to, the the profession cares a lot about the integrity of those who hold the office.
Ali, would you like to weigh in, or should I move on to our next question?
No, I think that was for the judge and justice. You can.
Next question.
All right. We've had several iterations of the same question that I want to pose for you, and that is, what can citizens do to strengthen trust in the judiciary, and what can citizens do to strengthen democracy and the rule of law?
Debra?
Oh, I want to, Allie's got the research base, but I'll offer, I really think engagement. And in this sense, I'll say it that I try every day, so in big ways and small ways, to talk to at least two or three people I've never met. I'm sorry, I'm like those ads about don't become your parents. That is me from start to finish. But I think it's really important to listen to one another and to come to conversation with the understanding that at a very human level, we all want the same thing. We want to be seen and heard and valued, and just try to have conversations across differences. And that happens less and less, and especially as people get behind screens, or just their own bubble of news feeds. So I think having real conversations is something. It seems so small, but it's a really important thing, because we see great success stories of where communities have just built strong institutions and a lot of vibrant engagement. And it's a very human exercise. So, so anyway, let me just recommend that. Talk to two or three people you've never met about what matters, and see how it goes, and just try to model that civility.
I totally agree with Chief Justice, and I've asked lawyers to go out there. Don't just talk to each other. Talk to the people in your PTA who are not lawyers. Talk to the people in your congregation who are not lawyers. Get the word out beyond what you do in your law practice to talk about how important the independence of federal and state judiciaries are to the everyday democratic life that we cherish here in this country.
I'll just add, I think I would agree, putting yourself in the same room as other humans, increasingly the longer that I live in this work on the information space, the more I think about putting yourself in a space with other human beings where you can collect context about who they are and where they come from beyond what comes out of a screen. The other thing that I'll add, I think, is learning to speak the same language. And I think that goes on both sides for the judicial branch and for citizens. I think we have our own way of talking about the courts. We speak in terms of the rule of law. We speak in terms of judicial independence. And the public may not use those terms. People who have not gone through a legal education, they may think more about fairness and justice, and people sitting on the bench think about those things, of course, all the time and speak about them all the time. But I think learning to speak somebody else's language and put yourself in somebody else's shoes when you do connect with them is incredibly important. Mhm.
Thank you to all of you. I recognize we're approaching time, so I'm going to try and fit in one more question here. And Justice Stevens, you mentioned, folks behind a computer and some of the impact that's having. One of the questions we received is, how do you think artificial intelligence is impacting our courts, and how do you think technology is impacting the public's understanding of the legal system?
Yeah, it's a really challenging time, especially because emerging technologies. I mean, go back to DNA, or we talk in the courts about the CSI effect. I mean, every time there's something that captures the imagination, then the expectations change, even about courts. What people expect of evidence, what they think is happening, whether we're actually making decisions or not, or are we just running everything through a machine? I mean, I laugh about that calling balls and strikes. I'm a big baseball fan. I mean, it turns out AI can do that. So I worry greatly about that. I also worry just about what we're seeing in education inputs and in people in writing and communication and critical thinking. I just don't think we've tapped scratched the surface of the various implications. The other thing that makes me really concerned is that especially any big data sets, and the more I learned about AI, and I've been involved in the National Court Sciences Institute. We do science education for judges, so I've spent some really excellent time, including with folks at UW, learning more about AI. But I do worry about data distortion and the commodification of data. And so what people put confidence in, it's going to not have stuff that's behind paywalls. It's going to have, we're going to keep building on that. And I think that's going to erode trust in the decisions that are being made based on evidence, on data. And that's the heart of what we do. We make decisions based on the facts.
I was at a Mariners game the other day where the home plate umpire was reversed on more calls than I've been reversed in my 36 years as a trial judge. But one of the problems that we're having is I saw a video the other day of Yankee manager Aaron Boone saying he was quitting because his team was playing so bad, et cetera, et cetera. And it was so realistic, but it was totally fake. It was a total AI production. And I asked myself, how am I going to be able to tell in an evidentiary situation whether something is real or AI created? That's worrisome. The other thing is the people who are using AI, sometimes the lawyers do it and they mess it up. And we're thinking of passing rules to sanction lawyers who do that. But the main users are pro se's, people who are representing themselves and now have a way of getting legal advice from AI that also can be a little bit shady and sometimes wrong. So it's difficult for sure. I don't think you're going to see AI replace judges. I sure hope not. It may replace some law clerks. We're not sure about that, but for the most part, we really decide cases and conduct the courts like we did 200 plus years ago. Not that much technology has entered our courtrooms that affect what we do, and I think that's a good thing.
I'll just add, I worry a little bit that we'll allow AI to fill gaps in this moment of a trust breakdown and allow that to make things worse. I think there are a couple, or maybe just one, state Supreme Courts who have tried AI as sort of a case briefing method. And I think as we think through this sort of communication infrastructure challenge as part of rebuilding trust, I think in an extremely low resource environment we're struggling with cost effectiveness. It's really tempting to lean on AI to solve those, to kind of fill in those gaps, right? To produce like a clear and accessible messaging tool. And it's not to say that that's wrong. It could be useful. It could be interesting. I think I just worry that we won't perform that gut check of, is this something that we really should be doing, or should we be hiring an independent human being who can do that work and build human trust between this institution in an imperfect human kind of way. And that's where I land.
Well, a sincere thank you to all of our participants. We're going to conclude the Q&A portion of our event this evening. I have a couple of brief housekeeping items I'll touch on before we end our webinar, but before I do, I want to say a sincere thank you to our experts. Justice Stevens, Judge Lasnik, Ali, thank you so much for providing your insights and expertise. We truly appreciate you being here with our community and truly appreciate your appearance here tonight.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Okay.
I also want to say thank you to our audience members this evening. We hope that you found our content informative and engaging. If you'd like to see more content from the Center for an Informed Public, you can scan the QR code that will appear on the screen momentarily. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning of our webinar, UW Impact and webinars like this one are directly supported by Alumni Association member dues. If you're not already a member of the Alumni Association, we hope you will consider learning more and joining by clicking on the link in the chat or scanning the QR code that will appear on the screen. With your support, we can continue to work on behalf of our community. Thank you to everyone for being here this evening. We hope you have a great night.